Within just 72 hours, a gold mine worth over $3 billion was sealed off. 41 children were rescued from an underground hell, and the one who started it all wasn't a tycoon or a soldier, it was a dog. While the world scrambled to claim the gold, only one man stood up. His name was Traoré. But can he really stand against empires that once used resources to swallow an entire continent? The tunnel breathed like a wounded beast, slow, shallow gusts of stale air, pulsing through the broken ribs of rusted scaffolding. Somewhere far above the surface, world basked in the dry Sahel sun. But here, 30 meters below the earth, groaned softly in its sleep. President Traoré exhaled. The beam from his headlamp sliced the darkness like a blade, illuminating nothing but decay, walls streaked with old water stains, timber supports warped with time. The skeletal remains of mining carts, their wheels long fused into the ground. His boots squelched in the mud. The air was wet, thick, dense enough to chew. It smelled of iron, sweat, and something else. History. Not the kind written in books, the kind buried in silence. Behind him, the only sound was the soft panting of his companion. Bikari, his old Malian shepherd, padded cautiously through the narrow shaft ears, twitching nose to the floor. The dog was aging gray and the muzzle slower now, but still alert, still sharp. "Easy, boy," Traoré whispered. His voice echoed back like a ghost mocking him. Just a little deeper. He didn't tell his guards where he was going that morning. He left his office in the presidential palace just after dawn, boarded an old military jeep without flags, and drove east far from the headlines, the debates, the lawyers, the drone of bureaucrats. He came here for silence, for answers. This shaft had been closed for over 20 years after a partial collapse killed 6 men. Since then, most people avoided it, said it was cursed, too unstable. But yesterday, a retired geologist had whispered something into his ear. There's something beneath Zone 12. Something the French never reached. And now here he was, 30 meters down, heart pounding. Bikari froze. The dog's tail stiffened. His ears perked. Slowly, deliberately, he walked up to a jagged section of the tunnel wall, just left of a collapsed timber brace. Then, without warning, he began to scratch. Not the aimless pawing of curiosity. No, this was focused, frenzied, as if he smelled something beneath the stone, something urgent. Dust flew, small pebbles tumbled. Traoré leaned closer, gripping the damp wall for balance. And then he saw it, a glint. Faint at first, like a whisper of light trapped behind decades of rock. He stepped back, shone his light. The scratch marks cut through layers of shale and iron-rich soil, and there exposed under the thin skin of earth was a seam of gold. Crude, rough, untouched. The kind you only see in textbooks or myths. For a moment, Traoré didn't breathe. His mind raced through every possible explanation. Could it be fool's gold? A chemical reaction? A trick of the light? No. This was different. He dropped to one knee, brushing dust from the seam with his bare hands. The stone flaked off like old scabs, and beneath it a thread of molten yellow, raw and alive, snaking deeper into the wall like a buried vein. "Vang Nguyen Sin, Chua I Cham Jen," he muttered in disbelief. His voice trembled. And then something cold clicked into place in his chest, a sense of gravity. This wasn't just a discovery, it was a crossroads. A mine like this could change everything, pull Burkina Faso out of debt fund, schools, hospitals, industry. But it could also attract vultures, foreign corporations, shadow contractors, mercenaries disguised in suits. Bikari sat head-tilted, eyes locked on the gold. Almost reverent. Traoré looked around. Why here? Why now? Why him? And then a sound. Faint, metallic. Behind the wall, a single clink, like something shifting. He turned off his headlamp. Silence. Nothing. But in that darkness, he felt it eyes. Somewhere beyond that wall, someone or something was waiting. Bikari growled, wanting to flee, wanting to dig further. Traoré stood up slowly, one hand still on the glowing vein. This was no longer just a mine, it was a fuse, and someone, somewhere was already holding the match. The golden seam pulsed faintly under the flickering light of his headlamp like a sleeping serpent just beneath the skin of the earth. Traoré stood, frozen fingers, still dusted with the earth that had concealed it for generations. But even as he stared at the shimmering vein, his mind was no longer here. It was back in Dona, the mining village where he had grown up, where the sound of iron picks striking stone echoed louder than any laughter. He was 11 when the shaft collapsed. His brother Idrissa had just turned 16. That morning, Idrissa had packed a tin lunch, kissed their mother on the forehead, and winked at Traoré with a smudge of coal on his cheek. By noon, the tunnel had swallowed him whole. They never recovered the body, only his helmet. Traoré remembered gripping it, bent bloodied, but still warm, while the other boys stood in silent horror. That day he learned that the earth didn't just give, it took. He closed his eyes now, taking a long breath. The tunnel around him was the same, the smell of sweat and soil, the weight in the air. But this time he wasn't a child. He was the man in charge, and he had just unearthed power. He turned toward Bikari, who sat silently, still fixated on the golden seam, as if guarding something sacred. For a moment, the sparkle on the rock reminded Traoré of the metals the foreign contractors used to wear gleaming, polished worn proudly over shirts that never got dirty. They'd fly into the country in private planes, talk about opportunities and growth, and fly out with pockets full of promises and silence. And the children, they stayed, bent back, barefoot bones visible through skin swinging, pickaxes too heavy for their frames. Every time he saw one of those photos resurface on the news on the cover of Western magazines, he felt a sickness in his stomach. Because behind every child miner rescued headline was a reality never told, for everyone save 10 more went deeper. Now standing here, the light of real gold glinting in his eyes, that same sickness returned. This wasn't just about a mineral deposit. This was a trap, beautiful, ancient, impatient. He knelt beside the gold seam again, ran his fingers along it. It was warm. Bikari nudged closer. The dog's ears were low now, as if he sensed the weight settling over his master's shoulders. "We found a treasure," Traoré whispered, voice barely audible over the quiet hum of earth around them. "But will it consume us instead?" He looked up, and in the reflection of the gold, he saw something strange. Not his own face, but the flickering silhouette of a boy, barefoot, holding a rusted pickaxe, eyes hollow. Then another, and another. A procession of children like ghosts trapped in stone staring back at him. The light danced cruelly. He blinked. Gone. Only gold remained. His breathing grew shallow, his pulse louder in his ears. A strange realization struck him. This place was too quiet. Not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of secrets of something waiting. He stood slowly and pulled a small vial from his pocket, a sample container he'd brought on instinct. He pressed it to the seam and scraped off a small portion, enough for analysis, for proof. Bikari growled softly again. Not loud, just enough to say, "We're not alone." And maybe they weren't. Because power always comes with eyes in governments, in boardrooms and satellite feeds orbiting silently above. He glanced once more at the exposed gold. How long had it waited to be found? How many lives had it already taken in its silence? And what would he do differently? Because now the question wasn't, can we extract this? It was, should we? The weight on his chest was heavier than the mountain above him. Traoré turned to the darkness of the tunnel behind him and whispered, not to Bikari, not to himself, but to the vein itself. "If I let them touch you, will I ever get my people back?" The gold didn't answer, but it didn't have to. Because deep down he already knew some treasures don't belong to the greedy. They belong to those brave enough to protect them. The silence shattered. It began with a low rumble, subtle at first, like the growl of some ancient beast stirring in the belly of the earth. Then came the crack, sharp, violent, unnatural. A sound that didn't belong to stone settling or supports shifting. Traoré froze. Bikari barked once, short, instinctive. Then the ground lurched beneath him. A second later, a blast of air slammed into Traoré's chest, hurling dust and splinters through the tunnel like shrapnel. He hit the ground hard, shielding his face. A deep roar echoed through the shaft, and then everything was darkness, chaos sound. The ceiling groaned. Wooden beams snapped. A section of the tunnel behind them collapsed in a choking spray of stone and earth. Dust engulfed everything, swallowing the light from his headlamp, muting the bark of Bikari, as the dog scrambled coughing toward him. Bikari Traoré choked out. He couldn't see. He could barely breathe. The dust clung to his lungs, gritty and hot, mixing with adrenaline and fear. He reached blindly, fingers brushing rock splinters, then fur. Bakari whined, licking his handtail, weakly tapping the ground. Relief flooded him. He pulled the dog close and crawled forward until he found an air pocket near the wall. His headlamp flickered, then held. Through the haze, he looked back toward where they'd come from. The tunnel was gone, buried under several tons of stone. No way back, no way out. Unless he turned and followed the narrow path they'd been exploring earlier, the one leading deeper. Dust trailed behind him like smoke. Every breath burned. Every footstep sounded like thunder. But as they moved forward, his mind sharpened. This wasn't natural. That blast, it was precise. Too precise. He'd been in mines long enough to know the difference between a cave-in and a controlled detonation. The echo, the pattern, the smell, it reeked of military-grade explosives. Placed just far enough behind him to trap, not kill. A warning, or worse, a message. Someone had known he was here, and someone wanted to make sure he didn't leave. As he and Bakari emerged into a wider chamber, a small loading area from decades past littered with rusted tracks and abandoned tools, Traoré leaned against the rock wall, catching his breath. The gold, the vein, the secrecy, it was already unraveling. His thoughts spun fast. Only a handful of people even knew about this shaft. The geologist, his driver, a single advisor. Could one of them have sold him out, or was it surveillance? A foreign drone. He looked down at Bakari, now sitting, breathing heavily but alert. "We're not alone anymore," he muttered. Then louder into the empty dark, "Seal the mine. No one in, no one out. Someone has smelled the gold." The words echoed through the chamber like a verdict. And somewhere far beyond that tunnel, someone was already planning their next move. The news didn't leak, it erupted. By the time Traoré had climbed out of the sealed shaft, cleaned the blood and dust from Bakari's fur, and made a secure call to his inner circle, the story was already circulating. Not in full, but in fragments enough to set the country on fire. A blurry aerial photo showed a mining convoy returning to the capital under escort. Someone on the inside had posted it to a private forum. Then it jumped to Twitter, then TikTok, then the world. President Traoré uncovers buried gold. Massive vein found in forbidden shaft. Is Burkina Faso sitting on the next African El Dorado? In under 48 hours, 1,000 conspiracy threads bloomed across the internet. Some claimed the mine had magical origins. Others insisted Traoré had known all along and was hiding it from the people. One post shared over 300,000 times featured a deepfake of him smirking beside a glowing vault. But not everyone was skeptical. In villages where children still fetched water from rusted wells, the news spread like holy prophecy. In the cities, horns honked and songs were sung on street corners. People danced with hope, raw, impatient, trembling hope. Finally, something ours. But with that hope came hunger. At a private government assembly 3 days later, Traoré stood at the head of a long mahogany table, flanked by ministers, analysts, and a single quiet military advisor. Some looked at him with reverence. Others, calculating eyes, folded hands, waited like traders, eyeing a volatile market. On the screen behind him glowed three numbers: $3.2 billion and 47% yield, estimated 18 years of extraction. No one spoke. Traoré broke the silence. "We found it," he said simply, his voice calm but edged with iron. "It's real. It's massive. And yes, it can change our future." He let the weight of that truth settle before continuing. "But this," he gestured toward the projection, "is not just a resource. It's a test. For us. For our integrity. For our sovereignty." A low cough from the Minister of Commerce. "Mr. President, with respect, if we delay, others will act. Foreign partners are already circling." "Euromine has reached out," I know, Traoré interrupted. "They're offering upfront capital, full operational support, global supply chain, and in return control. Not partnership, ownership." The room stiffened. Another minister, younger, bolder, leaned forward. "Then what's your plan? We don't have the infrastructure to handle something this size. The bureaucracy alone? We build it." Murmurs, scoffs. One man whispered something to his aide, who smirked. Traoré raised a hand. Silence fell. "We mine it. We manage it. But we will not be owned by it." He paused, then added more slowly, letting each word cut through the silence. We will not be colonized again just with newer paperwork. For a long moment, no one spoke. Outside, the hum of generators and distant horns framed the tension in the room. Then the Minister of Finance cleared her throat. If we refuse Euromine outright, markets may react. Sanctions pullouts. Let them react, Traoré said. I won't sell our future for fast applause. We dig with purpose, or we do not dig at all. Some stared at him with admiration, others with unease. But no one challenged him, not yet. Later that night, he walked alone through the palace gardens, Bikari at his side. The city lights twinkled beyond the walls like scattered stars. Somewhere below the shaft remained sealed, guarded by trusted soldiers. In the distance, fireworks burst red, green, gold. Hope was rising, and so was the storm. The offer came wrapped in velvet, metaphorically speaking. 3 days after Traoré's announcement, a private jet bearing the Euromine insignia landed quietly at Ouagadougou International Airport. No press, no official reception. But those who needed to know knew. The men inside didn't wear uniforms, but their presence radiated the calm confidence of people who were used to owning rooms before entering them. They brought a file, not thick, just 26 pages, $200 million up front, exclusive operational rights for 25 years, revenue sharing at 12%. A full legal framework was enclosed, drafted under the bilateral investment treaty between France and Burkina Faso, reinforced by clauses from international arbitration courts in The Hague. Every word was soaked in legality, every paragraph designed to feel inevitable. This, said the envoy, a silver-haired executive named Marcel Lemaire, is a gift for your people. No burden. We handle the risk, the infrastructure, the extraction. You receive income, stability, global trust. The room was silent. Traoré studied the contract with careful eyes. Not angry, not surprised, but deeply methodically concerned. His ministers flanked him, each flipping through copies. Some nodded. Others underlined terms with silent pencils. The room reeked of nervous calculation. He closed the file slowly. You've had this prepared for a while, he said. Lemaire offered a thin smile. We're always ready to assist our partners. You've never partnered, you've purchased. Semantics, Lemaire said. The gold is in your soil, yes, but your markets are still in ours. Don't mistake geography for leverage. The words hung in the air like poison. Later that evening, in the quiet of his study, Traoré sat alone beneath a flickering desk lamp. The contract lay open beside him, untouched since the meeting. Bikari slept curled at his feet, but the room felt tight, suffocating. He poured himself a glass of water, but didn't drink. The numbers in the offer were staggering. The upfront sum alone could clear a quarter of the national debt, pay overdue salaries, stabilize the currency, fund infrastructure programs that had been stuck in limbo for years. And more importantly, it could buy time, political time, international goodwill, a period of calm after years of unrest. But what would it cost? He thought of his father, who died without ever owning the land he farmed, of his mother, who cleaned government buildings until her fingers bled just to send him to school, of the boys in Dona still digging with bare hands, living in the shadows of contracts like this one. Would they be proud if he signed, or would they understand? He stood and walked to the window. Outside, the city lights flickered like restless thoughts. Somewhere out there, people were celebrating a future they didn't yet realize was under negotiation. He felt the weight of it again, the unbearable equation. Dignity or stability, legacy or compromise. He heard his own voice echo from days earlier. We mine it, we manage it, but we will not be owned. Idealism, they'd called it. Noble, dangerous, naive. A knock on the door. His chief advisor stepped in, holding a briefing folder. Mr. President, international lenders are reacting. Currencies dipped. We may face trade pressure from Paris if we don't respond by the end of the week. Let them wait, Traoré said quietly. We could renegotiate. Push them to 18%. Add local labor guarantees. And when they agree, what will they ask in return 6 months later? Silence. The advisor hesitated. The people are hopeful, sir. But if we lose control of the economy, hope fades fast. Traoré looked back down at the contract. He imagined the gold underground silent, watching, waiting to see what kind of man he would become now that it had revealed itself. Not every battle is fought with guns. Some are fought in boardrooms, in legal footnotes, in quiet nights when no one is watching. He picked up a pen and did not sign. Not yet. Because some choices are too heavy to make quickly. And this was a choice that could reshape a nation. The sky above Ouagadougou buzzed faintly, almost imperceptibly, like a fly orbiting the sun. But Traoré noticed it. So did his security detail. High-altitude drones, unmarked, circling low enough to watch, but high enough to deny. On the ground, the signals were far less subtle. Outside the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, a convoy of 7 black SUVs waited in orderly silence, windows tinted flags barely fluttering in the dry breeze. Inside, the marble lobby filled with the echo of polished shoes and diplomatic urgency. They hadn't waited for an invitation. Traoré sat in the upper chamber, jacket off, sleeves rolled, collar loosened but posture firm. Across from him stood Ambassador Etienne Duval, France's special envoy, a career diplomat, with decades of practiced charm and a gaze sharp enough to gut a deal with a smile. Duval didn't waste time. "We're not here to impose," he began. "We're here to collaborate. Burkina Faso has found something powerful. Europe wants to see it protected and used wisely." Traoré said nothing. Duval opened a leather folder, sliding it across the table like a dealer laying down a winning hand. A joint venture, 50-50 management, capital infusion technology, legal shielding, access to European markets, total diplomatic support, no hidden clause. The room was quiet, and the gold stays in your soil, Duval added gently. But your economy gets lifted into the next century. Traoré stared at the folder. He didn't touch it. Outside the window, a group of school children passed the gates in matching uniforms. One of the girls had a hole in her shoe. She smiled at a guard. The guard smiled back. Traoré leaned forward slowly. "You speak of markets," he said. "But what we found beneath our feet isn't just a mineral. It's a mirror. It shows us who we are and who we're willing to become." Duval's smile twitched, the corners stiffening. "Mr. President, I respect your vision. But history has proven partnerships protect nations from chaos. Isolation breeds instability." Traoré's voice didn't rise. It dropped. Low, calm, heavy. "I won't trade children's dreams for European banks." Duval blinked. "I beg your pardon?" Traoré stood, eyes locked on him. "I won't sell a future we've never truly owned, just to balance books we didn't write." A silence, long and pointed. Duval slowly closed the folder, lips tightening into diplomacy's final resort. "We expected idealism. But I must warn you, investors hate unpredictability. And I hate graves filled with children holding pickaxes," Traoré replied. "So here we are." Bakari barked once in the hallway, loud and sharp. The ambassador flinched, then collected himself. He gave a short nod, turned and walked out. The drone above circled once more, as if waiting for permission to descend. It didn't get it. Not that day. Not yet. It began with a sound no one could place, deep, metallic, and wrong. A distant hum that rose through the ground like a whisper of violence. Then came the blast. The explosion tore through the southern corridor of the mine like a beast unchained. A wave of fire dust and stone slammed into reinforced walls, shattering supports and collapsing nearly 60 meters of tunnel in less than 10 seconds. Screams echoed through the darkness. Machinery crumpled like paper. The security outpost near the secondary entrance disintegrated in the heat and pressure. Inside the command tent, above ground, alarms screamed to life. Traoré was already running. He and Bakari had just returned from a strategic inspection when the ground beneath them shuddered. A plume of smoke surged from the mine's mouth like a black signal flare against the pale sky. People scrambled, engineers, guards, miners, some shouting into radios, others coughing from the dust that now covered everything in a choking haze. Down in the triage tent, blood pooled on the canvas floor. 2 men were dead. 7 others were badly wounded, broken ribs, torn flesh burns. Traoré's face was stone. "Where exactly did it happen?" he asked, his voice low and cold. One of the site engineers, his face smeared with soot, one arm bandaged, pointed toward the blast zone. "Corridor Delta, south side, near the old French shaft." Bakari was already moving. The dog nostrils flared, ignored the chaos, and pushed through the side path, tail stiff, body low. Traoré followed without hesitation, boots crunching over shattered stone. The deeper they went, the hotter the air felt, not just from the explosion, but from the rage building in his chest. They passed scorched rock, collapsed beams, a melted generator. The wall at the far end of the tunnel was warped, peeled outward from the inside. This wasn't gas buildup. It wasn't structural failure. It was deliberate. Then Bakari stopped. The dog circled a pile of rubble, sniffed hard, and barked once short and sharp. Traoré stepped forward, knelt, and brushed away the dust with his bare hands. Something metallic glinted beneath the ash. A detonator, military grade, European wiring, still warm, and beside it, half melted but unmistakable, a timing module, the kind used in remote-triggered devices. He stared at it in silence for several long seconds, feeling the weight of what this meant press against his ribs like a buried knife. This wasn't a warning anymore. This was escalation. This was war. He stood slowly, breathing hard. This wasn't an accident, he said, a loud voice, echoing through the fractured shaft. This wasn't a collapse. He looked at the wreckage, the twisted metal, the injured men, the ghost of fire still lingering in the air. This is a resource war. His words weren't rhetorical. They were a verdict. Later that night, in a sealed intelligence meeting inside the presidential bunker, Traoré laid the device on the table. His inner circle sat in grim silence. A few of them swallowed hard. Others looked away. They've stopped pretending, he said. So must we. We can't confront France directly, his defense minister said cautiously. Not without proof of state involvement. We don't need proof. We need resolve, Traoré replied. Someone believes they can scare us back into obedience, into surrender. But this, he held up the charred detonator, is not a negotiation tool. It's a declaration. Bakari lay at his feet, eyes locked on the door as if expecting it to explode next. From outside, the distant wail of ambulances mingled with the drone of media helicopters circling overhead. The world had begun to watch more closely now, not because they cared, but because they smelled movement. Traoré stared out the window, then spoke again, this time to no one in particular. They want our gold, but they'll take our lives if they must. We will decide if we die for it, or if we fight for something bigger. It was journalist Fatou Diallo who uncovered the truth. Not with a drone, not with leaked memos or satellite images, but with a pair of worn boots, a borrowed ID badge, and a camera hidden in her scarf. She had gone deep into the Zone 4 shaft where foreign contractors were conducting geological studies. What she found were children, thin, soot-faced and silent, swinging hammers, dragging ore sacks nearly their weight, working in pairs, crying only when no one was watching. The youngest was 7. Fatou didn't run back to the surface. She stayed for hours documenting everything, whispered interviews, smuggled voice notes, footage of guards looking the other way. She uploaded her data the moment she resurfaced. By dawn, the world had seen it. Clips of barefoot boys crawling through cracks flooded social media. A video of a child passing out from exhaustion under Euromine banners was broadcast on Pan-African networks. The footage went viral in less than 12 hours. Burkina Faso awoke in rage. In the capital, hundreds gathered outside the National Assembly. At universities, students marched with signs, "Not one life for gold." At mosques and churches, preachers wept. At night, the streets did not sleep. And neither did Traoré. By the next morning, he called an emergency press conference. He wore no suit, just a plain linen shirt, sleeves rolled, dirt still on his boots. The footage played silently on the screens behind him. Faces of children, cuts on small hands, a girl with missing fingernails. Then silence. He stepped to the podium and spoke with no script. This is not a foreign scandal. This is our shame. We let them back in. We gave them tunnels, and they filled them with children. He paused. Effective immediately, Euromine's license is revoked. Their personnel will leave this country within 72 hours. All legal immunity is void. His words were calm, unshaken. And I will not ask another soldier or guard to do what I myself will not face. I am going down there. Myself. Today. The room erupted. Reporters shouted questions, flashing cameras. But Traoré had already turned. At the mine entrance, he wore a hard hat and gloves. Bakari walked beside him. His convoy had tried to stop him, citing safety. He refused. The military offered to lead. He declined. The descent was long, The dust hung heavy, and the air reeked of sweat and diesel and sorrow. Then he saw them. A row of small bodies sitting against the tunnel wall, eyes wide and blank. Some looked up when he approached. Most didn't. They had stopped expecting kindness. Traoré didn't speak. He knelt. He reached out gently and picked up the first child, a boy maybe 8 bones sharp under his skin. The boy didn't resist but leaned in with quiet, instinctive desperation. A minute later, Traoré returned for another. Then another. He didn't stop until all 41 had been carried out. No cameras were allowed underground. But the footage taken outside the president of a nation walking into the sun with a soot-covered child in his arms was enough. That image circled the globe. And for the first time, the conversation shifted. No longer about ownership contracts or GDP, but about who we become when no one is watching. The backlash came fast and sharp. Within 48 hours of Euromines' expulsion, European markets turned cold. The Eurozone Commodities Exchange downgraded Burkina Faso's mineral stability rating. Major European banks paused credit lines. Trade partners pulled back quietly, no statements, just silence and canceled meetings. Then came the statements. Unilateral disruption of legal frameworks, a concerning shift toward isolationism, destabilizing conduct from an increasingly unpredictable regime. France's foreign ministry called the revocation a breach of cooperative norms. Germany expressed grave concern. Brussels hinted at sanctions, not full embargoes, but enough to rattle foreign investors and dry up vital funding streams. The currency dipped. Fuel prices spiked. In the markets of Ouagadougou, merchants whispered about shortages. Mothers counted francs twice. Farmers tightened their belts, unsure of what the next season might bring. But amid the fear, there was fire. Traoré's speech had gone viral. Not just the press conference, but the footage, him carrying those children from the mine, replayed on radio screens and murals across the nation. At night, students painted it on alley walls. Children reenacted it in schoolyards. And at the center of it all, Bikari, the dog who had first scratched the gold, who had barked before every danger, who had stood beside his president not as a pet but as a sentinel. A grassroots campaign lit up online Bikari, Guardian of Hope. 2 days later, Parliament passed a symbolic resolution conferring Bikari the honorary title Le Gardien de l'Espoir, the Guardian of Hope. People wept in the streets not just out of pride, but out of terror. For the first time in decades, they were truly standing alone. No umbrella of old empires, no safety net of hidden deals. Just themselves, their leaders, their choices. The pride was real, but so was the cost. And everyone from the poorest street vendor to the highest minister felt the weight of what came next. Because dignity does not fill stomachs, and sovereignty does not calm markets, but neither does silence inspire revolution. That night, Traoré stood at his office balcony, watching torchlight processions wind through the streets. People held up signs of Bikari, of the children, of the gold vein etched beside their national flag. They were afraid, and they were proud. Both truths lived in them now, and that he realized was how nations are born. The marble chambers of the International Court of Justice were built to impress high ceilings, polished floors, flags of every nation, lined with solemn symmetry. Everything about it whispered authority civility rules. But that morning, as the case of Euromines versus Burkina Faso was called to session, there was no mistaking it. The tension was war thick. At the petitioner's bench, Elena Rossi adjusted her dark blazer. Euromines' lead counsel was known in corporate legal circles as the ice hammer, precise, immovable, and devastating. Her Italian accent was crisp, her language surgical. In her world, treaties were scripture, and numbers were facts that feelings couldn't touch. Across the aisle sat Awazita, barely 40, wearing a simple navy suit, her hair tied back. Her eyes held none of Rossi's calm detachment. They burned with something different memory. Rossi stood first. She cited precedents. The Bilateral Investment Treaty of 1982, the OECD's resource security clauses, the arbitration panel's past decisions in Niger, Sierra Leone, Papua New Guinea. Burkina Faso, she said, violated a standing legal and internationally recognized contract. No evidence was presented that Euromines sanctioned child labor, no charges filed, no convictions. This is not about morality, it is about the sanctity of global economic order. Her voice was elegant, distant, cold. Then it was Awa's turn. She didn't rise immediately. She opened a folder, removed a single photograph, and held it up. It showed a boy barefoot, knees bloody, holding a pickaxe twice his size. His face was turned away, but his spine was visible through his skin. The image had been authenticated and verified by 5 independent sources. Then she stood and spoke without notes. We are told that contracts are sacred. But what is more sacred than a child's body, than a childhood stolen by shadows and silence? She walked slowly toward the judges. They say there were no convictions, but here she held up a second photo or names. Doctors who treated crushed fingers, teachers who counted missing students, parents who buried children. Her voice didn't rise. It sank heavy with unflinching weight. We are told that law is blind, but must it be deaf as well? These children were not invisible. They were just ignored. Rossi objected, citing emotional manipulation, but the lead judge, a Chilean magistrate with 3 decades on the bench, allowed it. Awa continued. She brought up Fatou Diallo's footage. She introduced Bakari's initial discovery as context, not heroism. She cited UN child labor protocols, but also quoted Burkinabe poetry, speaking of minds as mouths that swallow names and return only numbers. And then she paused. If we lose this case, the gold flows. Markets stabilize, investors return. But every time someone wears a necklace pulled from that mine, they will wear bones beneath the gold. A silence fell over the chamber. Not the awkward silence of legal tension, the sacred silence of truth. Even Rossi did not speak. Outside, reporters swarmed the steps. Headlines had already begun forming. Burkina Faso stands its ground. The children in the courtroom. Justice or just business, inside the judges adjourned to deliberate. No one knew which way the ruling would fall, but one thing was clear. This was no longer just about a contract. It was about who the law was meant to serve and what it was meant to protect. The tribunal resumed under a different kind of tension, not louder but deeper. The kind that grows after something important has been said and no one dares to move too quickly for fear of erasing its echo. Awa Zita returned to the floor for closing arguments. She didn't bring more files, data, or legal charts. She brought a leash. And Bakari. The dog walked into the courtroom calmly, his dark coat now silvering around the muzzle, his posture alert but gentle. Cameras didn't flash. Reporters didn't speak. For a few seconds, the room simply watched. Your Honors, Awa began, standing beside him. This is not a prop. This is not for show. This dog is the reason we are here. She placed her hand lightly on Bakari's back. Bakari didn't find gold. He found the truth buried under years of silence, lies, and corporate polish. Rossi objected again, this time more sharply. Madam President, the dog is not a witness. This is spectacle. Awa didn't even turn to her. It's strange, isn't it? She said instead, her voice calm, that we call this spectacle. Yet not the contracts signed in languages we do not speak. Not the clauses that take more than they promise. Not the silence when we ask for help. She took a breath, then stepped forward. Bakari scratched a wall, and something hidden for decades was revealed. He acted not from greed or ambition, but from instinct, from loyalty, from an unspoken sense that something was wrong. She let those words settle before continuing. We call this a court of justice. But if justice exists only in ink and not in truth, then what exactly are we protecting? There was no rebuttal. The chamber was still. Outside, the streets of Ouagadougou were no longer quiet. Tens of thousands had gathered near the National Assembly beneath banners, strung between rooftops, scrawled with new slogans in red and gold paint. Justice is not sold by the kilo. Bakari found truth, we will carry it. Children are not collateral. It wasn't just Burkina Faso now. In Dakar, Nairobi, and Bamako, murals of Bakari and the rescued children had begun to appear on street walls. In Madrid and London, university students held sit-ins outside embassies. Online, the hashtag #JusticeNotContracts trended across platforms. The story had grown too large to be managed. It had become myth, the kind born not in fantasy, but in the undeniable weight of lived experience. Inside the courtroom, Rossi made her final remarks. Cold, brilliant, calculated. What is law if not structure? If we allow emotion to override agreements, we replace order with chaos. This court is not here to determine what is heartbreaking. It is here to uphold what is binding. Her words landed sharply, efficiently. And yet something had changed. Because across the room, Bikari lifted his head slightly and let out a quiet huff, barely audible, but enough to stir a chuckle, a shift in breath. Even the lead judge couldn't suppress a faint smile. Sometimes the truth doesn't argue. It simply exists. Later that night, Traoré stood atop the steps of the presidential palace, overlooking the crowds below. He held no microphone. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The people were speaking now in chants and song and silence. They had seen something real. And once you see truth, no law can unsee it for you. A child approached the platform carrying a hand-painted cardboard sign. On it, just 5 words, "Let the dog lead us." And for once, the world listened. The courtroom was silent as the presiding judge returned the panel of magistrates seated in solemn formation. No media sound, no camera clicks, just the weighted hush of a room holding its breath. When the gavel struck, it did not echo. It landed like the exhale of a continent. In the matter of Uramin versus Burkina Faso, this court finds in favor of the defendant on the basis of humanitarian exception and compelling evidence of contract breach via undisclosed labor violations. Euromine shall pay restitution for damages caused during unauthorized labor activity. The company may petition for renegotiation under newly defined ethical constraints and transparent national oversight. The room stirred, half gasping, half applauding. Awa Zita closed her folders, slowly, hand steady. On the opposite bench, Elena Rossi did not flinch, but her jaw tensed. She had lost the core, the moral center, and she knew it. Bakari sat quietly at Awa's feet, tail thumping once. Outside, the crowd erupted. Cheers burst into the air like thunder, raw, unpolished, honest. Flags waved from rooftops. Voices rose in chants of, "Truth has weight, and we are not for sale." Across African cities, church bells rang. In newsrooms around the world, headlines raced to press. Burkina Faso wins landmark victory at The Hague. Justice over gold, a continent's moral turning point. Children over contracts, global court sides with the people. But in the press room, Traoré remained composed. Flanked by Awa and military advisors, he stepped to the podium, not triumphant, but calm. "Today we did not defeat a company," he said. "We defended a future. We told the world that our children are not bargaining chips, that justice still matters." He let the cheers outside fade before continuing. "But this is only one ruling, one day. The war for dignity, for self-determination is not over. This was the first battle, and we won it, but more will come. They will come with prettier contracts, with more polished threats, with new faces wearing the same old greed." He paused. "We must be ready, not just to resist, but to build." In the courtyard that night, a small bronze plaque was placed beneath the national flagpole. It bore no title, no politician's name, just an inscription. "Some treasures are not buried in the earth, but in the choices we make to protect each other." And just beside it, quietly sitting in the grass, Bakari watched the stars. Because even in victory, the night would come again. But this time, the country would be watching back. The leak hit just after midnight. A whistleblower file uploaded to a local independent news forum. At first, few noticed just line items in a spreadsheet, dry bank logs and wire transfers with coded references. But by morning, it was everywhere. Minister Kabor linked to illegal payments from Uramin subsidiary. Screenshots flooded WhatsApp groups. Radio anchors read aloud from the reports. Opposition leaders demanded action. Protesters gathered holding signs once again. But this time not against the West, against their own. Inside the presidential palace, the mood was heavier than it had been since the day of the mine explosion. Traoré sat silently at the head of the table, the document open before him. The room buzzed with argument advisors debating next steps, legal counsel outlining scenarios, but none daring to speak the one thing everyone knew: Kabor had betrayed them. Minister of Strategic Resources, a founding member of Traoré's government, a war veteran, and now a liability. The evidence was precise: a series of payments made over 18 months funneled through a shell corporation registered in Cyprus. The purpose: smoothing bureaucratic approvals, keeping inspections quiet, blocking reforms in the early days of Uramin's return. No one knew how deep the influence went, or who else was complicit, but Kabor's name was now scorched. That afternoon, Traoré summoned him. The once proud minister entered with slow steps, head bowed. He looked older than he had a week ago, his suit hung loosely, eyes sunken, lips dry. He didn't deny the charges. He didn't even sit. "I don't come to argue," he said, voice low. "I come to explain." Traoré folded his hands. "Then speak." Kabor swallowed. "2 years ago, my daughter Aminata was diagnosed. Bone cancer, stage 3. The treatment, it was in Paris. I couldn't afford it. Not on a minister's salary. Euromean's offer was quiet, clean. I told myself I'd return the money later." His hands trembled slightly. "I told myself I was buying her life, not selling our country." The words hung in the room like smoke impossible to clear. "I know what I did," he said, "and I know what must happen. Remove me. I deserve it," he paused. "But please, don't let her die in shame. Don't let her think I was only the man who fell." Traoré stood slowly. He walked to the window, hands clasped behind his back, watching the gardens below. A few children, staff members, sons and daughters, were kicking a ball near the reflecting pool. "Do you regret the crime, Kabor?" he asked. "Or being caught?" Kabor said nothing at first. Then quietly, "I regret believing I had no other choice." The room remained still. Finally, Traoré turned. "You're suspended, effective immediately, stripped of rank and pension. A formal inquiry will proceed." Kabor nodded. Then Traoré added, not unkindly, "But your daughter will receive treatment, not through Euromean's money, through the new fund we built for families who were forced to make impossible decisions." Kabor's eyes welled up. He tried to speak but couldn't. Traoré didn't offer comfort, but he did offer truth. "We're not rebuilding just our economy," he said. "We're rebuilding what people believe they're worth." As Kabor turned to leave, Bikari appeared in the hallway, watching silently, just as he had the day of the gold discovery. The minister gave the dog a quiet nod. Even now, Bikari was still guarding the line between what could be forgiven and what should never be forgotten. The announcement came at noon, quiet and without fanfare. A single statement from the presidency, printed on cream-colored letterhead and delivered to every major outlet. Minister Kabor has tendered his resignation, effective immediately. The government accepts this decision with solemn respect. The investigation into past misconduct will proceed independently and transparently. The news hit hard, not because it was unexpected, but because it confirmed what many had feared and others had prayed against. Kabore had been a symbol, a war hero, a builder of the new republic. His face was on posters and textbooks carved onto the stone facade of the Ministry of Strategic Resources. Now it would be removed. But alongside the statement, another detail emerged, whispered first, then confirmed. President Traoré had ensured Kabor's daughter was flown to Geneva for urgent treatment, at state expense. The backlash was immediate. Some denounced it. "We don't owe traitors mercy. Justice should be blind, not sentimental. A criminal is a criminal." But others, many others, responded differently. In neighborhoods where fathers had stolen bread to feed children, where mothers skipped medicine so daughters could stay in school, Kabor's story struck a chord. It was not a justification, but it was a recognizable wound. Radio hosts debated for hours. Students gathered in forums. One prominent columnist wrote, "We cannot become so obsessed with purity that we forget we are human. If our justice leaves no room for compassion, then what exactly are we trying to build?" In a televised interview that evening, Traoré addressed the nation. He didn't excuse Kabore's actions. He didn't soften the truth, but he humanized it. "He broke the law," Traoré said. "He will be held accountable. But I looked into the eyes of a man who knew what he'd done and still pleaded not for himself, but for his daughter. I chose to act not as a politician, but as a father." The camera panned to the crowd gathered outside the palace. Many were silent, some nodded, a few wept. In the days that followed, something rare began to take root, a national conversation not about revenge, but about repair. Public trust, shaken by the scandal, didn't crumble. It evolved. People didn't forget Kabor's betrayal, but they also didn't forget Traoré's choice. And in that choice, they saw something they weren't used to from power restraint. Principle. Mercy without compromise. A mural appeared 2 blocks from the Parliament building, a painted image of Kabor walking into shadow, head bowed, while his daughter stood in the light looking back at him. Underneath it read, "Redemption is not freedom. It is facing the cost of what we've done and choosing something better." The artist remained anonymous, but the message lingered. And in the silence after scandal, a nation took a breath, not because everything was fixed, but because for once the right thing had been done even when it hurt. The presidential decree was signed just after dawn. No parade, no stage celebration, only a simple press briefing beneath the rising sun, the golden light washing over the white pillars of the state building as if the sky itself bore witness. Traoré stepped up to the podium, flanked not by ministers or generals, but by a circle of children, rescued minors, scholarship students, children of street vendors. Each one stood in quiet, solemn attention, their eyes full not of innocence, but of a new awareness. Behind them sat Bikari, alert and silent. Effective immediately, Traoré announced, his voice steady, Burkina Faso will enforce a total and permanent ban on all forms of child labor. Any individual company or foreign partner found in violation will face criminal prosecution under the full weight of the law. The words were simple, but their weight was enormous. This was not just a policy, it was a promise. A nation that had once turned a blind eye now opened both and refused to close them again. He held up the signed document, the seal of the Republic stamped clearly across the center. The cameras clicked. But even in that moment of formality, something softer stirred. One of the children, Fatou, aged 9, whose hands had once bled from hauling ore, stepped forward. In her small palms, she held a white dove, trembling but unbroken. She released it. Then another child followed. Then another. Dozens of doves rose into the sky, circling above the palace like breath finally released. Bakari barked once, then sat perfectly still, tail curled neatly against his paws, as if he too understood the gravity of the moment. That image, a dog watching the doves take flight, children behind him, a leader before them, would appear on posters, murals, and textbooks for generations. Not as propaganda, but as memory. Because this law wasn't just about punishment, it was about protecting something fragile, something that had too often been forgotten between wars and debts and broken promises. Childhood. In the weeks that followed, local task forces were formed to enforce the new law. Rural inspections increased. Education grants were expanded. And for the first time in decades, rural families were offered real alternatives: books instead of pickaxes, clinics instead of bribes. There were challenges, resistance loopholes, old habits, but the foundation had been laid. And more importantly, the people believed in it, because they had seen it born not in bureaucracy, but in blood-truth sacrifice. And the quiet loyalty of a dog who scratched at a wall until a nation woke up. 6 months later, the gates reopened. Not with sirens, not with foreign executives cutting ribbons, but with quiet dignity. A sunrise shift, the hum of new equipment, the sound of boots on dry earth. No flags of international firms. No security checkpoints manned by foreign guards. Only Burkinabe. Men and women stood at the mouth of the reopened gold mine, wearing new uniforms, stitched locally helmets, freshly issued tags bearing their full names, not numbers. They weren't miners now. They were members of the country's first state-owned, cooperative-run resource operation, Coamba Gold Union. Traoré had renamed it himself. Coamba, meaning to rise again in Mossi. The mine itself had been transformed. The tunnels, once riddled with danger and shadows, now gleamed with reinforced structures, safety lights, and mapped ventilation systems. Independent inspectors rotated monthly. Workers had health insurance, rotating shifts, pensions, access to on-site clinics. Above ground, a cooperative office stood where Euramine's command tent once towered. Its windows were open, its doors unlocked. Every contract, every purchase order, every export metric was available for public audit, updated in real time on digital screens mounted outside the building. People came just to look at the numbers, not because they didn't trust, but because they finally could. Traoré visited unannounced. He wore no presidential sash, no entourage. Only boots dust on his sleeves and Bikari trotting faithfully beside him. He shook hands with every worker he passed, asking names, listening to jokes, nodding at progress. In the mess hall, laughter echoed, not forced, not staged. Men and women sat elbow to elbow, eating hot meals served not by vendors, but by a rotating team of co-op members. Everyone contributed, from laborer to foreman. Near the main shaft, a mural stretched along the wall, children releasing white doves. Bikari standing guard beneath, and beneath it the inscription, "We no longer dig with shame, we dig with pride." And it was true. Where once children hauled stones in silence, now their parents worked earning wages to send those children to school. Some of those very children had returned not to labor, but to intern as engineers, surveyors, safety officers. One girl, Isa too, now 14, greeted Traoré with a clipboard in hand. She had been one of the rescued children. Now she was part of a youth oversight committee reviewing environmental safety. "We're building a sensor alert system next month," she said, grinning. "How soon can I test it?" Traoré asked. "Not until we're sure it's president-proof," she replied deadpan. They both laughed. But not everything was perfect. Some global firms still refused to trade under Burkina Faso's new gold classification, citing traceability concerns. Certain banks were slow to return credit lines, and whispers of new offshore interests circled like vultures. But none of that felt like defeat, because what had changed wasn't just policy, it was posture. Burkina Faso no longer begged for extraction. It offered partnership or nothing at all. And the people once divided between silence and survival now spoke openly. In councils, on radio, at schools, they debated budgets, they questioned leadership, they demanded updates, because now they believed they had a right to. That evening, Traoré stood at the edge of the mine as the sun set behind the hills. Bikari lay beside him, head resting on his paws. The ground beneath them still shimmered faintly, not just from gold, but from the light of what had been fought for. Dignity, visibility, ownership. He didn't speak. He just listened to the rhythmic clang of tools, the voices of proud workers echoing through stone, and the silence where once there had been suffering. A new day had begun, and this time it belonged to them. The hall was built from stone pulled from the very earth that had once hidden pain. Polished granite columns framed the entrance, and inlaid along the floors were ribbons of iron copper and gold trace lines of the minerals that had shaped, cursed, and finally redeemed a nation. On the front of the building, carved in 4 languages, were the words, "Truth is the brightest resource." This was not a government facility. It was not a museum. It was a heritage and resource learning center, cooperatively managed, open to the public, free for all students. The people called it something simpler, the Hall of Light. Opening day was cloudless. Children arrived, first bussed in from villages and towns, some wearing school uniforms, others barefoot but bright-eyed. Elderly former miners stood near the entrance suits, pressed their hands scarred but steady. They'd spent years underground. Now they were here to guide a new generation toward the light. Inside the central atrium, a wide circle of polished marble opened into a skylight. At its center, cast in solid bronze and coated in gold leaf, was a single paw print. Bikari's. The impression had been taken during his last year, molded carefully and blessed in a small ceremony led by the very children he helped rescue. Now it sat at the heart of the hall, not just as a memorial, but as a reminder. Sometimes the smallest among us are the first to see the truth. Traoré stood quietly as people gathered around the golden paw. He didn't speak right away. He didn't need to. Children knelt beside it, touching it gently as if for luck. Some traced its curves into their notebooks. And then the tours began. There were no paintings of kings or war heroes. Instead, the first gallery showed documentary photographs, shadowy tunnels, hands covered in coal dust, tired eyes behind makeshift helmets. Not to shock, but to teach. In the next hall, modern interactive exhibits lit up with animated maps of Burkina Faso's mineral veins, geological layers, and historic mine zones. Touchscreens allowed students to simulate safe drilling operations. Models explained how proper air circulation could prevent gas buildup. There were 3D printed ore samples to study, not sell, and standing in each room were former miners, the very people who had once been voiceless laborers, now educators. One man, Duda, who had lost 3 fingers in a shaft, collapsed 15 years ago, now taught children how to identify raw quartz and pyrite. His voice was soft, steady. "This is fool's gold," he explained, holding up a small crystal. "It shines like wealth, but it's brittle. You can't build anything on it." Some children laughed. Others nodded with quiet understanding. In the afternoon, a ceremony was held in the open-air amphitheater behind the hall. Students performed a spoken word piece about dignity. Girls in traditional dress danced beside displays of solar-powered mining tools. A young boy gave a speech on why he wanted to study metallurgy, not to find gold, but to make something honest with it. Traoré, seated quietly in the third row, wiped a tear he didn't expect. Bakari, no longer walking as fast as he once had, lay in the shade nearby his ears, twitching as the children's voices filled the air. As the sun dipped low, the hall of light glowed, not from gold, from glass and stone, from lanterns lit by students, and from the open doors that would never be locked. This was no longer a country clawing at the earth for survival. It was a nation building upward, one memory, one lesson, one paw print at a time. The morning was soft with haze, the kind that blurred rooftops and made everything feel gentler, like the world was waking up without urgency. President Traoré walked alone, his hands behind his back, his pace unhurried. He had asked for no escort today, no cameras, no officials. Just a quiet route through the east quarter of Ouagadougou, once one of the poorest neighborhoods, now home to new roads, modest housing blocks, and a school rebuilt with funds from the National Gold Cooperative. He stopped at the edge of the schoolyard. Children poured out onto the grass during their morning break, laughing in bursts, racing between benches and trees. A few sat in clusters, flipping through books. One group was building something strange with sticks and bottle caps, something that resembled a miniature drill. Traoré smiled. What he didn't hear was just as striking. No hammers, no metal scraping stone, no cries in the dark, only joy, curiosity, innocence unburdened. A teacher approached and greeted him quietly. She didn't bow or snap to attention. She smiled like a citizen, not a subject. "Would you like to come inside?" she asked. He shook his head gently. "No. I just wanted to hear the sound of the future." As he turned to walk the path home, his boots crunched over gravel that had once been dust and ruin. The sunrise was rising higher now, brushing gold along the rooftops. Not the kind buried in mines, but the kind cast by light earned in air. He thought of everything: the cave-in, the courtroom, the protests, the betrayal, the child in his arms, and of course, Bakari, still alive now, growing slow and gray, waiting back at the palace gardens. The old dog no longer chased birds, but he still watched every gate, still followed Traoré room to room like a shadow made of trust. The president stopped at a small bench outside a bakery. An older man waved at him. A young boy offered him half a mango. A girl pointed at his boots and asked why they were dusty. He looked at her, then down at the street that stretched behind him and said softly, "Because some roads are worth walking all the way." She nodded, not understanding, not yet. He continued on. And as the wind lifted gently through the jacaranda trees, he whispered more to himself than anyone else. "Funny, isn't it? How a nation found its gold, just because one dog decided to bark." And then he smiled, not for the cameras, not for history, just because for once the weight of the world felt light enough to carry. Key words: unity, sovereignty, light. The hall in Addis Ababa was older than it looked, marble polished, smooth by decades of footsteps. Chandeliers hung low with a faint golden haze. It had hosted summits, spats, peace talks, and moments of deafening silence. But that morning the air inside shimmered differently. For the first time in decades, Africa wasn't here to react. It was here to propose. President Traoré stood at the center podium, framed by the deep green of the African Union flag. He wore no medals, no special uniform, only a simple lapel pin, the golden paw of Bakari. "The age of begging for partnership is over," he began. "The age of quietly watching our future sold back to us, that ends now." His voice did not rise. It didn't need to. Silence fell across the chamber as screens around the room displayed images from Burkina Faso, the Hall of Light, the cooperative mine children in classrooms, and beneath it all, a single phrase: the Pact of Sovereignty. The proposal was clear: a continental agreement, voluntary but unified, to declare non-negotiable national ownership over critical natural resources. It offered legal frameworks, oversight mechanisms, and a common defense clause for states resisting foreign coercion. More than that, it offered dignity. "We do not reject trade," Traoré said. "We welcome it, but not at the cost of our children's breath, not in exchange for our silence." There was a moment's pause. Then from the Kenyan delegation, a hand was raised. "Kenya will sign." Mali followed. then Senegal, Ghana, Rwanda. By the end of the day, 20 nations had placed their signatures beneath a golden seal. We are not your minds. We are your equals. The world watched, some with support, some with fear, but Africa for once spoke first. Of course, it didn't end cleanly. The day after the pact's ratification, a French diplomat arrived in Ouagadougou unannounced. Ambassador Duval, polished, deliberate, unfailingly polite, requested a reconsideration meeting. Not to challenge the pact, but to soften it. Surely, Monsieur President, we can find language that reassures markets. The global system relies on predictability. Traoré offered him tea, served it himself, then said, I agree. And for the first time, we're making it predictable. We will sell gold, but never our children, never our silence, and never again our sovereignty. Duval hesitated, then placed a folder on the table, a new offer from a European consortium higher than any before. Traoré pushed it gently aside. We've already found something more valuable. And he stood. That evening, the final signatures were added in Accra under the stars. Delegates raised their hands not just as officials, but as fathers, daughters, teachers, farmers, survivors. No press spectacle, no parade, just 20 flags, one document, and a continent finding its voice not in defiance but in belief. Across African cities, bells rang again, this time not in protest or warning, but in unity. And on the streets of Ouagadougou, people lit candles, not because of grief, because of promise. The memorial was small, quiet, and sunlit. Nestled between the Hall of Light and the cooperative mine, it wasn't built from marble or stone. It was made of clay and ore, earth from the mine, hand-mixed by students and former miners, then sealed with quartz from the original gold vein. At the center stood a modest platform, and on it, a golden plaque. Not for a man, not for a monument, but for a dog. Traoré stepped forward, old now slower in his stride. In his hands, he carried a velvet cloth. Wrapped within it, cast in bronze and polished to mirror shine, was Bakari's paw, molded in his final days just before he passed peacefully under the jacaranda trees. With quiet reverence, Traoré pressed the paw into the center of the plaque where the soft clay had been prepared. The mark held, then hardened, then gleamed. He whispered to no one in particular, not all gold is buried in stone. Some of it walks beside you, waits at your door, and teaches you to listen before the world shouts. He stood for a long while. A group of children gathered nearby, their teachers, telling them the story not just of Bakari, but of how a dog's bark led to a nation's awakening. One little boy looked up and asked, will dogs always know where the gold is? Traoré smiled, his eyes wet. No, he said, but the good ones know where the truth is. As the sun set over the mine, that once broke bones but now built futures, the last light hit the plaque just right, and Bakari's paw shimmered golden as if leading once more. Above, a breeze stirred the trees, not an ending, a beginning, a continent no longer waiting to be discovered, but finally discovering itself. A story of gold, but also of light at its surface. This story begins, like many others, with the accidental discovery of gold, a rush of power, and the inevitable arrival of those who have long seen Africa, not as a continent of people, but as a vault of resources. But stay a little longer, and you'll realize this isn't a story about gold. It's a story about truth. It's about how one man, Traoré, chose to stand not for profit, but for principle. It's about a child's hand being lifted from the dirt and handed a pen instead. It's about the silence of exploitation being broken not by outrage, but by the bark of a dog who simply refused to ignore what he sensed. There's something deeply moving in that, because real change often doesn't come from declarations. It comes from moments, from a dog scratching a wall, from a girl learning geology in a place she once labored, from a father who, even in shame, asked for forgiveness, not for himself, but for his child. The beauty of this story lies in its layers. Yes, it's about resistance to exploitation, but more than that, it's about the reconstruction of dignity, about building systems where justice is not reactive but proactive, where children grow up with the memory of hope, not just the absence of fear. And most of all, it reminds us that the weight of history does not have to define the future. It can guide it, but only if we choose to look at it, clearly take responsibility and walk forward together. Traoré did not become a hero because he was flawless. He became one because he chose to act when it was hardest. And that's something we can all take with us, whether we lead nations, families, or just ourselves. Because maybe the real gold isn't buried underground. Maybe it lives in the decisions we make when no one is watching. Maybe it glows brightest in the quiet kind of courage, the kind that walks, not marches. The kind that listens before speaking, just like Bakari did. And you, if you were in Traoré's shoes, would you dare to protect the truth even when it costs you everything? Or maybe the better question is, what would you consider your gold to be? And what would you risk to protect it? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth.